fantastic episode. I'm absolutely thrilled to have Christophe Roumier as my guest today. Christophe, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. I'm happy to be amongst you. I don't see everybody. I don't see them, but it's a great pleasure and a very new, a very experience for me. I'm very glad to be there.
New for all of us.
Huh?
Quite funny. If you'd asked me about how this works 2 months ago, I would have said I have no idea. But
yeah.
We're adapting, and the whole goal with these seminars is to use technology where we can to bring people together, because obviously we can't be together physically right now. So this is the way that we can do it right now. And so I'm going to explain how the format works before we dive in. We'll have people basically dialing in from all over the world, and the goal with these seminars is also to make them very interactive. So please give us your questions. We'll try to get to them as many as we can. If we have the questions in the beginning, then I can weave them into the conversation. And sometimes we get them all at the end, and it's impossible. So give us your questions now. We'll do our best to answer them. And we've got some wines open. I mean, this is just going to be tremendous. So, but first, Christophe, I hope that you and your team and your family is safe. Obviously, it's a kind of a particular time in the world.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Antonio. It's right. By chance, everybody at home, family and team at the domain, everybody is fine. Everybody is safe and healthy. We had no problem, and that's important. And I hope that it's the same around you for you too. And I hope everybody's safe also.
Yeah, I think our company is, of course, I think we're a little bit more behind the situation here in New York than you guys are in Europe. I hear things are starting to open up now in France a little bit, and that is gradually, and giving maybe people some solace. I'm curious, right now we're in May, middle of May almost. How has the current situation affected your work in the vineyard?
I have to say nothing. I mean, because we were able to work every day like normal, except that we had to take specific precautions, let's say, so that for instance, my workers could not stay in the same truck or car. They had to have their individual vehicle to go to the vines, and instead of staying one each road to the next, so 1 meter, we were positioned 2 meters, one worker every 2 rows, so that they had some space out, and we could work like normal. We have worked like normal. We have bottled this 2018 with a smaller team than usual. We were only 2 of us during 10 days, and during 5 days we were 3 of us to operate the bottling line, instead of being 4 full time. So it was just a little different. And we have planted a new vine also. I mean, everything has been done in the proper time and in a certain rush, because the season is very early. Yeah. But by chance, we can work like normal. Yeah.
So given that the season is early, what does that lead you to think about in terms of how this harvest is going to play out in terms of your seasonal help, your workers, your pickers? How are you going to manage that, do you think?
Yeah, the main question today, which I cannot answer totally, is how we will proceed for the harvest itself, because it's a bigger team. Harvest takes about 40 people, 45 altogether. And the problem is, how will we be able to move them out to the vineyards as a big team? We have taken the habit to feed the team, the workers at the lunchtime. And so this is also a question I have not totally answered. I don't know how we will proceed, because the season is very ahead. I know that we will probably harvest at the end of August. By chance, sometimes, most of the time, August is a month where the weather is fine. So maybe it's going to be easy to have a picnic instead of being turning back to a big room for the lunch, so that people will have some space around them, and it's going to be a bit more complicated, yeah, but I'm sure we'll find a way. People will have to wear a mask on their face, if we move them in cars, and and so that they can usually, if they, I mean, not usually, if the rules by the government have not changed, it's the way we can do things. Wearing the mask, eventually gloves, having sanitizer liquids for the hands, and keeping the same tool, not exchanging the tools. And it's probably going to be manageable this way if the rules have not changed in the meanwhile.
Yeah. How long does the harvest usually take at the domain?
It's a week. It's 6 days, 6 to 7 days of work. That's just for harvest. And then winemaking is, but it's a smaller team for winemaking. Winemaking takes about a month after that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. And I think it'd be interesting for folks watching if you could tell us a little bit about the history of the domain. Georges Roumier was your grandfather, correct?
Yes, and in fact, he established here in 1924 after he married my grandmother. My grandmother was born in the vintner family in the village here, and in the 20s the wines were not selling at all. The vines. People get rid of vines sometimes. They would eventually exchange vineyards against places to grow corn and things instead. And they received the vineyards as a dowry in 1924. The estate was a little smaller than today, but they already had some Chambol village, the Bonnemar, some Bonnemar, Amoureuse, the Musigny was here already. The Musigny was here as a sharecropping contract with my grandfather, and they had some Clos Vougeot also, a few vineyards. That was enough. It was about almost 8 hectares of vines. Vineyards and good holdings, and he started this way. And he was not born into any viticultural family, so he had to learn the job. Of course, when he married my grandmother, there was a team already operating the vineyards, and so all the workers of this team have shown him and explained him the work, the most of it. And my grandfather met the Comte Georges de Vauguet here. They became close friends. They were the same age. And in fact, I don't know for what reason, the Comte Georges de Vauguet offered my grandfather to turn to become his vineyard manager. And so my grandfather started like that. The Comte de Vauguet realized that my grandfather's wines were not so bad, and he offered my grandfather to become also the winemaker for the Domaine de Vauguet. And so my grandfather was the winemaker from 1928 up to 1955 for the Domaine de Vauguet. And this was for him an income, some salary that would complement what the estate Domaine Roumier was not making lots of money. And this was a good way for him to make some money for living and growing his children and everything. And also to purchase some vineyards that were very cheap. He had some opportunities to purchase some vineyards like the Clos de la Bussière in 1953, and some other places, some Bonnemar in 52. Well, this is the way things were happening for him. By chance, he has met the Comte de Vauguet, and I think that's the chance in his life.
And so the first vintage for the domain, if I remember correctly, is 1945, right?
No, the first vintage, which I don't have any remaining example here, was 1924. This first harvest was 1924. There was no remaining wine of this time. But because he has received the estate as a dowry with my grandmother, there was it was not a contract, but he was asked to offer to the family, to his uncles and to his uncles, to his family-in-law, some bottles of wine every year, just because he has received the vines as a dowry. So he was, for this reason, he was led to estate bottle some of his production. And from the 20s, he started to bottle just for the family purposes. And in 45, as you said, the harvest was so small that he decided to bottle the entire production in 1945, because everything was about this time of year. By the middle of May, there was a big wave of frost, and lots of vines have been frozen, and the harvest was so small that my grandfather said, I will bottle all the 45s instead of selling to the negotiants.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
After that, was all the entire production bottled as domain, or was there still?
No. Most of it was still sold to negotiants, and until the first year where we estate bottled the whole production was the vintage 1983 only. Before that, my grandfather, and then my father were selling the most of the production to negotiants, to bone negotiants.
Yeah, it's amazing how much Burgundy has changed in just, what is that?
Yeah.
Not even 40 years, 35 years.
It's amazing how much it has changed, and it's also a new era for Burgundy, because in the past it's never been like that. Very few estate were bottling their production. Very little, in fact. The habit was to sell in cask, in barrel. And yeah, I'm just at that sort of generation today where we estate bottle, which is very new for Burgundy. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because the practice is the negociants would deliver their barrels, and then you would fill them, and then at some point after the alcoholic fermentation, they pick up the barrels and age them in their cellar. Correct? That's still
yeah. Yes, the habit was that the producers would make the wine and sell in barrel. These would be negotiants, and negotiants would bottle in their own facilities and sell with their own trademark. Or lots of wine were sold in barrels, even to restaurants who would bottle themselves. Or it was a different time. People were buying a barrel of wine instead of buying cases of 12 bottles with 12 bottles of wine. Yeah, it's a different way today.
Yeah, today to buy a barrel of wine from one of your vineyards, if you could, it would be pretty like buying a house.
And and because of the bottling, estate bottling, now people realize that the wine is also good to age in the bottle. But before, people were drinking wines. A lot of wine were drunk very young. Even the Grand Crus, they were drunk very young, because they were sold in barrels, and so they were not aged as much as they are now.
Of course. And so then, what about your involvement with the domain?
I've been always involved by some means, because even as a kid, when I was 13, 14, I started to work during the summertime, after school, summertime holiday. I was working in the vineyards with my father. And I did not intend to turn to this job. Really, I thought it was an option for one day if I could not do nothing else, but I did not intend to prepare myself for that until I realized that wine was good also, and in fact it's not the viticulture that has attracted me, or the occupation itself. It's the wine. I realized that because I could taste some wines with my father from my grandfather's time, and I realized the wine was good, and it's the way I thought that I realized that was an interesting product, and so I found more attraction to it. And this was when I was almost 19 years in age, Before that, I was not totally decided. I was interested in mathematics and things, and so I studied mathematics and everything. And I turned into enology after I made the decision. I said to my father, "Is there a possibility for working?" He said, "Well, yes, if you want." But he was not so happy with that. But he said, "Oh, if you want, yes, I need some help sometimes." So I said, "Okay, I'll study enology. I will do something with that, whether this is in the family or whether this is somewhere else." And in fact, after I finished my study, I went to the military service because this was compulsory at this time. And right after, my father said, "Oh, if you want to help me, it's okay. You can come and work with us." And so I arrived. I worked with him in December 1981, and I never moved out. But at the beginning, this was not this was not so much. How do you say this? Determined. It was not totally decided this way. It happened like that.
Well, so speaking of wine, I have one of your wines open, which is 2004. I've got two open. We'll talk about them both, but one of them is the Chambeau Lecras 2014. What do you remember about this vintage? Because I think that these wines have turned out a lot better than originally people would turn out.
I always like them because the wines were very precise, very. And this was probably the comment that the vintage has received a lot at first. The wines were very fruit driven, with very supple sorts of tannins, a kind of ripe tannin, so soft and easy. And in fact, I think the wines are more serious. They have better depth than people have said at first. And it's a vintage which I do like a lot because the wines develop slowly. They have a very strong impression or reflection of their origins. So they exhibit by the taste their terroirs. And for this reason, it's a more serious vintage that has had the reputation to be. It's a vintage which I can drink today. I can age the wines also 10 years and more from now with no doubt about them. And I did the same. I've opened also a Bonne Mar 14, but because I have that in the cellar, of course. But I did the same. Just
I opened one of these too.
Yeah. It looks very much like mine, in fact.
Omar is one of my favorite wines of yours. I mean, obviously because of how good it is, but it's the first Roumier wine that I had. It was an 86 Bonne Mar Terre Blanche.
Oh yeah, this 86. This was also a very light-bodied vintage, but the wines are. I mean, I've always been impressed by the big vintages for the dimension of the wines, but very much attracted by the light-bodied type. And 86 is that sort. And because with dealing with Bonne Mar in a vintage like that, you always obtain something that has complexity, that has depth and capacity to age. If you ever have still one bottle of this 86 left in your cellar, it's a very, very good wine today still.
So what about, we've got a couple of questions about the Bonne Mar vineyard. So that's obviously one of your signature holdings. And Paul asks, what is the evolution of the vineyard holdings? Because you mentioned some of it was part of the dowry, right? And then other parcels were acquired in the 50s. Am I remembering correctly?
Yeah. There were several origins. That some were part of the dowry, which we still have a part of that. Some were purchased in 1952 by a Dijon family, which was the name was Bellorget. And this was a large section. The family Bellorget in Dijon had all the Bonne Mar laying on the Moret Saint-Denis side, and they had some other Bonne Mar aside this. And this was a very large holding, something like, I don't know, ça fait 0,7, ça fait almost 2 hectares of Bonne Mar. And so this was too big for one person. Let's say my grandfather. No, first, Monsieur Bernard Clair, so that's Bruno Clair's father, grandfather, sorry, was offered this vineyard to purchase from the family Bellorger, but it was too big for him. And so he contacted my grandfather and said, would you like to purchase, I purchased a piece of it. Would you like to purchase another piece of this vineyard in the same time as me? And my grandfather said, okay, but I cannot purchase the whole what you offer. And in fact, he contacted Monsieur Ponel. So Ponel was a negotiant in Beaune, and the family Ponel had already some vineyards. And for what reason, I don't know why he contacted Monsieur Ponel, but and so Ponel accepted to purchase a piece of this Bonnemar. My grandfather purchased another piece, and the domaine Claire d'Ahu at this time purchased the entire Bonnemar laying on Moret Saint-Denis. So on the red line, which is, how do you say, the
dotted line is the border between Chambon-Musigny and Moret Saint-Denis.
Yeah. And so it's between this line and the Clos de Tard. This is all Claire d'Ahu. So now that's Bruno Clair, which was purchased in the same time. And my grandfather purchased the next, just below this line, to Chambon-Musigny.
Okay. And where were the original parcels that came with the dowry? Very far apart, or?
They were in different sections. One which we still have today is by the M of Bonnemar and above.
Yeah, that's here.
Yeah,
in the middle.
In the middle. And another one was, let's say, yes, by a little below the O of Bonnemar, O and first N of Bonnemar, a little below that. But we don't have it anymore. Now that's my cousin who gets this. Laurent Roumier has this in charge now. So these were those three sections plus one, which is we still have today also, which is above. But it's a small one. It's difficult to explain. It's the right above the higher above right angle of the Bonnemar, a little higher, a little to the left, a little to the left, still higher up, where it's pink and red, because a part of it is Chambon. Yes, here, and another part was here. It's still here. I mean, we still have.
Okay.
And then my grandfather contracted a farming also with Bonnemar, just at the opposite, down to the south of Bonnemar. Yeah, a little above, a little above, a little higher to the left, let's say, a little to the left, still, yeah, and a little lower.
Okay.
Somewhere by there. He contracted a farming with a piece of Bonnemar here, a quarter of an hectare, which we have purchased since. We have purchased this vineyard and we still have it, but now we own it. This was a farming contract. Altogether, in 1952, we reached the maximum acreage of Bonnemar in 1952. With the new acquisition of Bonnemar. The acreage of Bonnemar was at 1 hectare 89. I don't know in acres how much it means, but it's 1 hectare 89 altogether.
You have to multiply by 2.25, I believe. Somebody from American winemaker can correct me, but that's more or less the calculation. I think. Okay. When I think in French, I think in French. When I think in American, I think in American, and the middle is that.
Okay.
Cool. So that's obviously super interesting. And are those parcels then vinified separately, or are they pretty homogeneous in their sort of attributes the clones and the grapes that you harvest?
This was, in fact, all these holdings were making 3 different cuvees, even sometimes four cuvees in the bigger years. But the habit was still to keep as a separate, always keeping separate the parcel that was purchased in 52, so which is the first which we have shown on the map, was made always separate. This is the red soil, which we call red. It's not red, in fact. The soil is brown red, which was always made separately. Otherwise, the other were blended more or less together because all the rest of the holdings were white soil. So that's more marly type of soils. And my grandfather was keeping them separately because this was his attitude, and my father kept the same. As they were, the two of these guys were selling their wines to negociants. They could offer 2 different options, 2 different versions of Bonnes to the negociants. And so this was, for them, a more easy way to sell, to market their Bonnes. My thinking of the Bonnes is just because it's, of course, it's not homogeneous. There are 2 different types of soil, quite different, that provide 2 different wines. My philosophy about the Bonnes is that the Bonnes is the blend of all this, because this is where it makes a better wine. It's more complex. It is deeper and more complex, and it's also the reflect of what is Bonnes.
Yeah, and we've tasted the separate cuvées in the cellar in the past. That's really interesting how different they are.
Yeah. There's always the white soil is always more. It's a wine with more tension, more minerally, more complexity, and the red soil provides a good depth. A wine with more, a bit more unctuous, a bit more. More chewy sometimes. I like if I had to choose, my favorite is always the white soil, because it's the one with the more, the better cut, the more complexity, and the more minerally definition in flavors, and also in tannins.
Yeah, for sure.
But the best Bonnes is always the blend.
Well, and it's fun when you can do those tastings side by side. We have a bunch of questions, so let's take some of them. One of them is from Omar, which is the name of the app that I took these screenshots from, and it's called Clima Vinea. I think I got that right. I'm going to show you this on this phone. Clima Vinea.
Oh, Clima Vinea. This is the map here. Yeah.
Right here, you can see on the top. Let's see if I can show this to you. That's the name on the top. Clima Vinea. It's one of the PTO apps. It's fantastic. It's just great for. Because it's not just it is the maps, but it's also, there's a lot of contextual information, like where the names of these vineyards derive from, and contextual information that helps understand the sites. So I really recommend downloading it. It's fantastic.
Yeah. And can you also position with the GPS when you are on the place? Can you position? No, I thought that they had developed that. No.
I don't know if you can do that on this version, but I haven't updated it in a while. It's possible, but it's really, really in depth.
In fact, I think they intended to develop the fact that with the GPS function of your phone, you could position on the map also when you are in Burgundy, not in New York. Huh?
New York is a little far away.
Yeah.
So you mentioned at the beginning of our chat, you mentioned that you had just replanted a vineyard. Was that a redevelopment of an existing parcel, or a completely new?
Oh no! This year we have replanted. We replant not every year, but once in a while, because that's the management of the vineyards. This was an old vine that was not in very good condition, no yielding very much. When you realize that on a certain vine, on an hectare of vine here, the density of plantation is 11,000 vines per hectare. And so if you lose, because when the vine is 20 years in age, you can lose, I don't know, on 11,000, you lose 10, 15 vines per year. It's acceptable. You pull off, you replant a new one instead. But when they turn very old, when these vines reach more than 60 years in age, something like that, you start to lose more. And then there's a time where you have to question, should I keep this vine still producing and replanting 100 or 200 on this 11,000 every year, or should I pull off and start a new vine? And this was the situation here. I had decided to pull off a vine of Chambol Village. This is a Chambol Village, and we replanted it this year.
Okay, got it.
It happens once in a while in the vine's life.
Yeah, no, it's a part of just the general rotational management of vineyard.
Yeah.
And we have another question about a new vineyard for you from Paul about Echezot, which is a new entry into your négociant wines that you make, right?
It's sorry.
It's one of the wines you make under your Christophe Roumier label, not Domaine.
No. Echezot is going to be Domaine Roumier. The Echezot is Domaine Roumier label. I have one here. Excellent. It's here. It's here. It's and so that's a sharecropping contract, okay, which I'm very glad. I'm very happy. I'm very chanceful to have that vineyard. That investors have purchased this vineyard in 2016. So we started in 2016 with it. It's a vineyard that was planted in 1944, and which is located en Orvaux. So it's behind, on your map you will see this, is behind the Château de Clos-Vougeot, and it's to the edge of Musigny, in fact. And the vine is in good condition for a 70 years vineyard. It's still in good condition. By the way, here we need to pull off some of the vines on this place, and we have done it already, to replace a few vines in the middle, because some of them are not in very strong conditions, so that we have something manageable. And no, it's an interesting project, and I'm very happy we've made it.
Great. How big is that parcel?
Oh, it's very small. It's 0.13 hectare. Just to give you an idea, the production is about 2 barrels of it. It's about 2 barrels.
Wow, tiny.
Yeah, it's a start.
I think sometimes people forget how tiny the production is of some of these. Here's the map of
oh yeah.
So where this is exactly.
So it's en Orvaux. It's
en Orvaux here, no?
It's to the top. You see, en Orvaux is written, a little above, and to your right.
Yeah.
Still to your right. Push to your right until you reach.
By the little road, no?
Yeah, you just follow this road. You follow this road, yes. Yeah, like that. And still, and just a little above. Yeah, now to the left. And here you are. It's by here. Yeah.
Okay, so we have a virtual vineyard tour of Echezot.
Yes, it's right.
Year 0.13 is going to give you a new wine in 2018. I think is the first vintage, as I recall.
No. 16 is the first. 16.
Sorry.
Yeah,
okay.
16 is the first. Well, 16 is the first because I signed for the contract in September 16, just a few days before harvest. So I just harvested and make the wine. I did not manage the vineyard on that vintage. The first vintage where I managed the vineyard was 17.
Okay.
And in 16 we got frozen. We had some frost in the springtime, and the production was extremely limited. I made only a half barrel of it, which I've kept. I mean, I didn't market. I did not sell the wine. And the first vintage that we will release the wine is going to be 2017. This one, 17 here.
Okay. So there we are. So there's Echezot, and then just to orient folks, here's Musigny over here. Here's Clos de Vougeot. So it's that sector.
Yeah, it's a good place.
Wow.
It's a good place.
Sure. One of the wines I've had of yours recently that I really loved was 2012 Clos de la Bussière. What is it about? I mean, the wine had a lot of richness and power, obviously, but what is it about Clos de Bussière? What are its signatures, its hallmarks of that place?
It's an interesting vineyard. My grandfather purchased this vineyard in 1953, just right after, the year after he purchased a piece of Bonne Mare, for very cheap values, because in 50s still these vineyards were affordable, and because the Clos de la Bussière is located on the edge to Chambolle, he thought that it would make about the same type of wines. He realized when he made the first vintage of Clos de la Bussière that this vineyard has really the Moret Saint-Denis type, because there's lots of clay by comparison to Chambolle, where we have lots of limestone. In Clos de la Bussière, we have lots of clay. We have limestone too, but a very thick clay, different kind. And as a result, the wine is always more masculine in style, a little bit more massive, but it's a really interesting wine. I really like the wine. Above all, I think since the global warming of the last 20 years has encouraged, has made this wine more. I mean, the tannins sometimes in the cold vintages were sometimes a little, how do you say that, square, a little bit edgy, where we have now smoother tannins in the vineyard, which is really lovely. I really like the style. Nothing to see with Chambolle. It's more, how do you say? It's more meaty. It's more. It's a powerful wine by comparison to Chambolle, which is just next. We have clay, and we have lots of iron. Also, we have iron stones in this place, which is very interesting. It's looking like a bullet. It's looking like yeah. It's really special. I like the wine.
Yeah.
I have the 10 here.
Yeah. So while you pour that, I mean, I always find that wine to be very dense and structured, and it also has a darker profile of fruit generally, and not as full as Chambolle's. It's a denser wine.
Yeah.
So
darker. I agree with the idea of darker. It's probably something in connection to the clay, I think. And Chambolle is not dark. It's lighter, and it's probably a bit more of Chambolle offers more vivid sorts of wine with more spring, with more cut, probably because we have so much of stones, lots of limestone, free limestone also, and it makes different sorts of wine for this reason, I think. Here I have the 2010, which I really like. I like the vintage. Because we have ripeness and acidity together, and it is a fabulous combination, I think.
Yeah. So that is one of my favorite vintages. It's my daughter's birth year, but I remember tasting those wines and just I loved that combination of acidity and concentration, which is pretty rare to have in the same vintage. So.
It's something that happens this last years, talking about the climate and the global warming and the possibilities that the global warming offers for riper vintages. It's interesting to see how much the acidity has kept did not degrade it. I mean, we did not lose any sorts of acidity. It's interesting to see how much the global warming keeps the wine still so far allows us to make balanced wines. We didn't lose acidity. If I remember in the 80s, in the first vintages where, for instance, like 85, we had lots of very high level of ripeness. We had also very high pHs. And I don't know for what reason today, with higher levels of ripeness, the acidity remains at a higher level too. We have low pH and high acids, even though we are very, very ripe. I don't know what has happened, in fact. Is this because it was necessary for the vine to adapt itself, to adapt its feeding cycles and things? It needed a few years, but today the wines are really interesting. We can talk about the 2018, for instance, that are of a very ripe style, but the acidity is still here. And it's very interesting to see how much the wines are keeping in balance, even though the climate has changed a lot.
And you think that's just adaptation that's happened over time?
Yeah. And, you know, when we made the 85, we still had the pH were totally, is very, very, very high. The acidity was very low. The level of ripeness was high, but we still had a very good expression of terroir. When we made the 1990 or the 89, these two vintages following each other were very warm again already in this time. But the two of them had low acids. And I've loved the wines of 89 or 90, but I was reproaching whether this was my winemaking, but I think it's not only me. Very often the wines miss a little bit of terroir expression. They are dominated by the vintage. When we make such wines, we still have the terroir coming through, and even very strongly. In vintages like 2018, 2019 also, which is very ripe, 2015, which is very ripe also, we have a very strong terroir expression. And we could think that the vintage type was dominant, it's not true. The terroir is still here.
Well, I mean, that's one of the, I think, definitions of a great vineyard, is that it gives you the personality of the vineyard no matter the vintage, no?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Got some comments I want to share with everybody. We have some incredible viewers, so I want to just share the comments that have come in. Robert Bort specifies it's 2.5 acres to the hectare. So thank you, Robert. I knew I was close, but I knew it wasn't perfect. So it's 2.5.
Okay.
And Semo says that you can do the tracking on the app. So that's helpful for anybody who wants to download the app. You can do the GPS tracking.
Okay.
So let's talk about, you touched on it briefly, but let's talk about winemaking. I'm just curious, we've got a few questions on this. What's your philosophy to a whole cluster for the domain?
It's one of the, the use of whole cluster is one of the arguments with my father at this time, because when I talked to you a little earlier, that I realized that the wine can be something, it's not only a beverage, it can be good also. And I found in love with some specific wines. And I've always loved the Dujac wines. The wine Jacques Cess was making for me, one of the best wines of this time. In the 70s, 60s, and 70s, he was making absolutely fabulous wines. I was very much attracted. Huh?
You went to school with him, didn't you?
Oh, in fact, yes, but he was also my neighbor, because he's living just besides the Clos de la Bussière, so I knew him, and so I knew his wines as much as my father's wines, almost. And I love his style. And I said to my father, you should do wines with that sort of flavors and everything. And my father said, oh yeah, but he's using stems. It's not the way to make the wine. I said, he's using stems. Okay. And and when I started to make the wine with my father, with him together, we operated in a winery together. I said to him, well, we should use a little bit of raw clusters so that we can have a part of those flavors. And even though he was not very positive, he said, okay, if you want to try, let's do that. And so we tried. And I started to intake more and some raw clusters in the 80s, not in 81, but in 82. Yes, the first vintage where I was making wine here. I started, not everywhere, not on all the wines, because also 82 was a big crop and we needed to, because making the wine with whole cluster takes more space in the vats. And so 82 was a big crop and the winery a little too short for everything in whole cluster. So we had to combine whole cluster and destem. And so I had another influence that was Henri Jaillet and Jacques d'Angerville, who were destemming people. And I said, well, maybe the good way to make the wine complex is to combine the two influences. And that's how I started to use some whole cluster. And in fact, little by little, I realized that the best was to use whole clusters when it was ripe, more than when the harvest is less ripe. So the riper the crop, the more whole cluster I would use. And in vintages, and so as with the global warming, as the last vintages are riper and riper, I use more and more as a consequence.
So this idea of having two sets of influences, does that mean that you would use a moderate amount of whole cluster that goes up with the warmer vintages, or that you might do some tanks with a lot of whole cluster, some tanks with none, and then blend them?
No, I prefer to be more consistent on all the fermenters and combine them after. No, okay. I prefer to do all the same way in the same vintage, because of course in a vintage which the last vintage where I would have destem as a majority was probably 13, I think. Yes, 13 was probably the last vintage where I've just used something like 15, 20%, 25% of all cluster, a little more in the Grand Crus. Otherwise, all the others, 14 and follow on, I'm using more than 50%, up to 80%, not 100, but 80, between 55 and 80% of all cluster. Yeah, all the vintages here. But I prefer to do all the fermenters the same, so that they have the same. How do you say that? They behave the same. They have the same speed of fermenting, and it's more easy and more logical also to follow.
No, so okay, so the whole cluster decision is really driven by the vintage.
Yeah.
And how does that affect how you manage the cap in fermentation?
The what?
Cap in fermentation with the whole clusters. How does that? How does your whole cluster percentage? How does that affect what you decide to do with managing the cap in the fermentation and the?
Oh, the cap. Oh, sorry. Well, I use the. I position the whole cluster at the bottom of the fermenters, and then destem crop at the top, so that some juice which is released by the destemmed grapes at the surface go through to the bottom, and this is where the fermentation should start with some liquid, and then when the fermentation starts, so underneath the whole cluster, it pushes up the cap to a little higher, and then we start to punch down gently, very gently, so that we don't break too much the whole clusters when the cap has started to push to the surface. But we try to do that very gently so that we don't break the whole clusters. And the destem, that's why I don't like to use 100%, because I like to have, if you imagine that the destemmed grapes to the top operate like a cover, like a seal, because it's more the air doesn't go through. You imagine that if you had whole cluster to the top, then it's more something where the air can go through and mold could develop and VA eventually. So I prefer to have at the top something which is this stem.
Got it. That's really interesting, obviously, because those approaches vary so much around the world.
Yeah, but I think these are, I don't know the word for this in English, but
hopefully I can find it. I can translate it.
Attends, des trucs this is some maniac thing, you know, but maniac in English means something different than in French. It means that small details, like habits that we like to have, because I know it works this way, but maybe the next person who will operate the winery instead of me after I'm finished will do different and do better. And so there is not a recipe. In fact, it's just some small things, which I think the truth in wine is not in the winemaking. The truth in the wine is included into the grape itself. And the winemaking is just here to benefit of the better way of what the grape is containing, but we don't make the wine.
Yeah, I mean,
so
that's
excuse me.
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, these details are things that we like to do because these are like habits and things we know they work well. This is all.
Yeah, creature of habit, I think, is the expression we would use in English to say that. But so let's go. So let's go back to farming, because your career, starting in the early '80s, it really coincides with one of the major changes in the world, which is the whole onset of climate change. So what have you seen happen over the last 30 or 40 years, and what are you doing differently today than you might have done in terms of farming, let's say at the beginning?
I think the big challenge today is the water, which is the rainfall, which have dramatically changed. I mean, we receive less rainfall than 25 or 30 years ago, and we don't have any frost, almost any frost anymore, nor snow, which means that the way that the organic matter from the dead leaves, from everything that, in fact, the organic matter is mainly from the dead leaves, also from when we prune, we crunch the woods after pruning, and they turn into organic matter on the ground. Also, the way the organic matter turns into feeding products for the vine has changed because of the water, which is missing, and because also of the temperature. It means that this organic matter converts into nitrogen products that feed the vines earlier than usually. And the vine needs the nitrogen as a feeding around just a little bit before blooming. Before that, the vine starts to grow its system to the surface, but also on the roots, because the roots also grow of it. So the growth of the roots, as well as the aerial system, is operated via what the trunks of the vine contain. The vine makes the trunk of the vine, as much as they get older, turn bigger and bigger. It means that the size varies because the vine builds up a pool system of reserves. It's amidon. Does it mean something? Amidon? No, it's
somebody can chime in.
Huh?
Somebody can chime in if they know what that means, but it escapes me.
And this is what they start in the springtime. The vines do not need very much from the root system to start to grow, but
Starch.
they need
starch. Starch.
Okay, yeah, all right,
yeah.
And just before blooming, they start to need some feeding from the root system, and with good climate and a good system, a good climate should provide the nitrogen feedings at this time. And today we realize that every year it's earlier. So it means that the vine do not use all what they have taken, have escaped in as a reserve with starch. They because of course they have something which is today they can reach a little earlier, and sometimes I think it's what could be an explanation for the small crop that we have the last years. They miss some feeding at the time of blooming, and we have bad fruit set then. This is probably why we have had a full decade with very small yield, short crops, small crops. That's sorry. Probably because of a problem of nitrogen that is being consumed a little earlier than it should.
Because of the change, because of the lack of water.
Because lacks of water, and or including because of higher temperatures in the winter. And so no more, because the conversion from organic matter to nitrogen to feed the vine is operated via macrobiotics which are living on the ground. And those macrobiotics do not turn into dormants during winter because the winter are too warm. So they still operate during the winter. And then the vine doesn't take its reserves, but uses the nitrogen because it's more easy to feed the first the growth, the start to grow the shoots, and then it misses a little bit of nitrogen at time of blooming.
Yeah. So one of that's fascinating, by the way. So one of the things that warmer vintages have created is also an environment for more disease in the vine. One of them being esca.
Not really.
Is that an issue for you in Burgundy? In your vineyards?
No, yeah, well, yes and no. It's not really true. I think we don't have more disease than before. I would say it's even less. We have more powdery mildew risks, which we call it odium in French. We have more powdery mildew than 30 years ago, where nobody would, some people ignored what was a powdery mildew in fact, but today we have to take this in consideration. We have less of mildew instead, and we have less of botrytis. This is true for the last 15 years. We have almost seen no botrytis, and that's I think this is more positive so far. But the rest is okay. We don't have more disease problems. No, this is okay. And it's also the benefits of this is that you may have heard this. More and more wineries, producers have turned into organic culture instead of chemic. And I think in the 60s or 70s, dealing only with organic culture principles was complex, I think, more tricky, whereas today it works and it's easy to operate, in fact.
Probably impossible in the 60s and 70s to farm biodynamically.
I think there were very few people to do that, and it was very, very risky.
Very risky, yeah, because you would lose the crop in a lot of vintages.
Yeah. But we always learn with mistakes, and I think because today we can criticize the people like my father who have operated the vineyards in the 60s. They were making the wine the way people were asking for that. I mean, people were asking for wine and not taking so much of attention to the details in taste and shape of the wine. And so my father was of that generation of people who were encouraged to produce more. just to make people happy, providing wines for people who are not asking and demanding for more detailed wines. And the use of fertilizer was much was very common in this time, just to make the vines producing more. But in the same time, the vines that are fed with fertilizer are also more appealing to disease. I mean, they were sometimes more subject to diseases than today. And that's probably something that we also, but now we have cut all fertilizers and everything. And it's probably also the reason why we have not so much of disease today. It's a little bit global, it's a little bit because of the climate, but also because we have stopped fertilizers use.
Yeah, and obviously people gain experience.
Okay. Yeah, and but you know, it took almost a generation to realize that some mistakes were made.
Yeah, but this is true all over the world. In the 80s, the idea was make as much wine as you can and sell it when you can. Yeah. And a lot of regions like Burgundy, people forget that these wines, there was a lot less interest in them than there is today.
Exactly.
That's not just Burgundy, that's in a lot of parts of the world.
Yeah, yeah.
You're pouring one of your wines. We opened some really great wines, but one of the wines I like that you make a lot is the Village Chambol.
Yeah.
You can't always drink Bonmar, obviously. At least, you know, like I can't, you can. But what are the parcels that go into that? And has it changed a lot in the last couple of years? Because
the Chambol Village. In the Chambol Village.
Yeah.
No, it didn't change. It didn't change very much. We still have, let me think, the big change occurred in 1989, in fact, because we had one of my uncle who had shares in the estate here wanted to take his vineyards. I purchased his shares of the estate, but he wanted also to take his vineyards back and bring them to his son, Laurent. Hervé and Laurent, the two of them worked the vineyard with. So I had a reduction of acreage of the estate. This is when we lost the Clos Vougeot. The last vintage of the Clos Vougeot was 96. Instead of cutting in 89, we made that along a few years, but the last vintage of the Clos Vougeot was 96. But also, the estate lost some Chambol Village sections, some Bonmar sections, and what else? That's all. Yes, that's all. But otherwise, after that, everything was very stable. And with the Chambol Village, no change occurred. And no, I still deal since 89. I still deal with the same vineyards. Same vines, same vineyards. No, same vines, no, because I pulled off some sections, replanted a little bit, but that's the normal management. And I purchased a piece of Chambol Village, which is an additional one in 2004, but that's not much. And that's all. No, otherwise, it's very stable still.
Okay. We talked a little bit about 18. What about 2019? How are those wines shaping up? We have a couple of questions on 19s.
Yeah, so 18 was very dry, very warm, hot in the summer. I think we started the harvest. I should have checked that before. I think I've started the harvest by the 5th of September. Maybe Robert can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't remember. I think by the 5th of September.
We'll know the answer to any question, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. The answer to any question.
18 was a very ripe crop. Very ripe means lots of sugars. So sugars means also high levels of alcohol and very ripe tannins. Ripe tannin means tannin very chewy, very velvety, very complex. And the wines are very dense. They were like very big wines before the malolactic fermentation. And after I made them, and before the malolactic fermentation, I said to myself, well, that's big. It doesn't taste like I like. And talking about dominant vintage, 2018, before Malo, was very dominant. All the wines were tasting almost the same. I was a little shocked with that because there was very little of terroir expression in these wines. They had some spine. They didn't have, by the numbers, very high acids, but they had some freshness in taste, but very little of terroir expression. And the malolactic fermentation here in my cellar, I managed so that the malolactic fermentation never start before the spring after the harvest. And I was happy it worked with 18, where most of wineries had seen their malolactic fermentation finished in the winter. And so I had to wait a little bit more than my colleagues, lots of my colleagues. But after the malolactic fermentation, that's very strange. You know, the wine, when the malolactic fermentation operates, you lose some acids. But the wines were tasting after Malo fresher than before. I don't have an explanation for this. I don't know. And as much as the wines have aged in the barrel until the December 19, the wines have turned fresher, more alive in taste, more fragrantful, less deep fruit, more fragrance, and more terroir, more variations of wine from cuvee to cuvee. This was very interesting to see the evolution. And so it came a point where I said, well, I like the wines the way they are, just take them out. So in January, I took them out of barrel and brought them to stainless steel for the finish. And the wines have continued, have kept on going fresher in taste. And we bottled them 3 weeks ago. It's an interesting evolution because this is not based upon acids. The acids are not very high in the vintage and the pH are quite are high, but I think it's a tannin thing. It's related to tannins. We had seen this with 2003, same sorts of thing, but here it's even more obvious and more spectacular in 18. And in fact, at first I didn't like the wines of the vintage. I have to admit that. And in December, I said, I start to like these wines. And I start to like them because they show their terroir and they show more freshness than before, which is not like normal. Right. 19, it's a different story. 19, oh, no. In fact, the summer is the same. It's very dry and it's very warm, like in 18. A little less ahead, a little less, ahead on the calendar, but still early. But the wines have, like in 15, reach high levels of ripeness. So by the sugars and by the tannins, by the flavors also, but the acids have kept very high. And we have very low pH in 2015, in 19, the same as in 15, and which are the same that in 2005, in fact. And the wines are really, really vibrant. They are fabulous. Today, they are starting the malolactic fermentation. We have just made something like 20% of it today. So I cannot really talk about the finished wines, but I have a very good feeling with the vintage.
Well, that's, I think, very exciting. I'm curious, you have a really incredible collection of vineyards in Burgundy, but if you could make wine from a vineyard that you don't presently own or farm, which one would it be?
Good question. I've always said, and I say it like that, I've always loved Clos Saint-Denis, but there's an explanation for that. It's Dujac. And so because I've always loved Jacques and Jérémy now, Clos Saint-Denis, and this is the vineyard I like. And yeah, Clos Saint-Denis. Clos Saint-Denis, and Romanée Saint-Vivant on the other side.
Romanée Saint-Vivant is fantastic, of course. But there's always a debate in Moret, Clos Saint-Denis, Clos de la Roche. So it sounds to me you're more Clos Saint-Denis.
Yeah. Well, you know, but I'm happy with that. I'm spoiled with what the estate contains today. It's really something. It's a big chance to have, you know, the selection of Grand Crus we have in the estate here. It's a big chance. So it's okay if I don't have the Clos Saint-Denis. It's okay.
So young, who knows? I'm curious. A lot of your colleagues have pursued projects outside of France and outside of Burgundy. Do you have any temptation to do anything like that?
No. I like to have my shoes in my dirt here, and no. Of course, it's tempting, but I don't forget where I'm coming from, and I like the work here. I like to see all the aspects of the work here, and as soon as you operate anything anywhere else, then you lose part of the contact on the place, which is no, it's not me. Okay. And no, I would rather like to take some time for myself, for my own, rather than doing something else somewhere else. You know, it's because I think you do less than half things. You know, it's no, it's not me.
Okay. I'm curious, what do you like to drink when you don't drink Burgundy?
Well, some champagne sometimes.
Oh.
No, yeah, I like any wine as long as they have as they are a combination of terroir expression and mind and people expression. So champagne is the immediate answer I provided to you to this question, because champagne has changed also a lot these last decades, and now we are tasting and drinking and enjoying wines from producers, individual producers, and I think it's fascinating. And so I like the new face of champagne, and because it's now wine with terroir and with people. And I like champagne, which I was not taking very much care of that before, and now I drink some for this reason. And I like very much the Loire Valley. I like, for the white wines, I like the Loire Valley because I like the Chenin. I like Chidène. I like you know, and so I like to drink these wines. When it's about red wines and it's not Burgundy, then I move to. I like to drink some Rhône Valley wines, of course. I like single varieties more than anything else. So in my cellar there are some wines from different producers of the Rhône Valley. I like some Barolo sometimes, which is a big change also in style, but I like the way the people are operating today, where there are some classics from ever, which I love. By the way, if Robert is around, thanks to him, he offered me a fabulous introduction to Barolo. This was a few years ago. And but I still remember it, and now I have some Barolo in my cellar. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, for sure, I think the single variety, it lends itself better to an expression of place, because you just have less interference of blends, right? It's Syrah, it's maybe with a little Viognier, but it's Syrah, it's Pinot Noir, it's Nebbiolo. And in Champagne, there is that explosion towards wines that are single variety too, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Or Chardonnay or Pinot Noir or.
Yeah, and single variety is also the best expression. I mean, the best link to terroir between the human action and the terroir, and the best expression is with single variety. There is no hiding. There is no, how would you say that? If you start to blend introduce another varietal, then you you start off blending, and you think of blending, and you are not so close to the truth as much as with the single, I think.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Well, Christophe, I know it's late in the day for you. Thanks so much for your time. I know everybody been thrilled to have you on our show. We had amazing questions. I hope maybe you'll come back again some other time, and maybe we can open some more wine. It's always a thrill to open a bottle of Georges Roumier, and so I'm really grateful for your time. Thanks everyone for your questions. My glass is empty, so I have nothing to toast you with. But
oh yeah, I toast you. I toast to you. Thank you, Antonio. And no, for me, it's a great pleasure because it's something new. It's I hope everything was fine. My English is okay, but it's not easy to talking a foreign language like this. But it also provides me the opportunity to drink some of my wine, because otherwise I drink some other people's, and so it's fine.
Well, your English is perfect. I think most people would dream of speaking French as well as you speak English.
Oh.
So thank you for your time. And it doesn't matter, because the passion and the interest and the engagement of the ideas comes through no matter what. So I'm toast you with thanks for your time.
Okay. Thank you, Antonio. Thank you, everyone. Take care.